still don't know what happened that night. This wasn't a dream. I was awake and it was real. It happened at my grandmother's house in the small village where she lived all her life. Every summer as a kid, I'd go to stay with her, just for a few weeks. She had a little home on the outskirts of town, right near the woods, and her house felt as ancient as she was. In the evenings, her neighbors would come by to chat, and they'd talk about strange things that had happened in the village over the years. Stories of lights seen late at night in the woods, of strange visitors who'd come to the village but were never seen leaving. They didn't sound like ghost stories, though. Just strange, inexplicable things, spoken about as if they were simply part of life. I was 14 that summer, and naturally I wasn't afraid. One night, my grandmother was out at a neighbor's house and had asked me to stay in. I sat in her dimly lit living room, trying to pass the time reading an old book I'd found on the shelf. I kept hearing this tapping sound, soft, like someone was brushing against the walls outside. It was faint, irregular, almost like fingers tapping out a rhythm. Every time I looked out the window, though, nothing was there. The tapping came again, this time from the back of the house. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a branch in the wind, because the next thing I remember was a sharp, sudden knock at the door. It was so loud it jolted me awake. I looked at the clock, 2:17 a.m. My heart was pounding as I stumbled to the door. I thought maybe my grandmother had come back early, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I can still see it. A small, dark shape on the porch floor. It was a handprint, but the hand was tiny, the size of a child's, and the skin looked gray and withered, as though it had been pressed into the wood years ago. As I stood there, I heard a voice, faint, whispering. It sounded like it was coming from the woods, like someone calling out my name. I knew better than to go outside, but my feet seemed to move on their own. I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes fixed on the dark edge of the trees. The voice was clearer now, almost pleading. I moved slowly down the steps, my bare feet touching the cold grass. The closer I got to the woods, the louder the voice became, until it was almost a moan, like a child's soft cry. Couldn't turn back. I took a few more steps, and then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the first trees. I couldn't make out any details, but it was small, its head slightly tilted, like it was watching me. The shadows seemed to shift around it, almost pulling it back and forth like it wasn't fully there. I stopped, frozen. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice caught in my throat. Then the figure stepped forward and I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. It was just blank, a smooth, featureless surface, except for 2 dark indentations where the eyes should have been. And that's when I noticed that the moaning sound wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from inside my own head. I don't know how I managed to move, but I backed up slowly, almost stumbling over my own feet. I turned and ran, bolting back to the house, slamming the door behind me. My breath was shallow, my hands shaking. I pressed myself against the door, half expecting it to burst open. For the rest of the night, I sat by the door, too afraid to move. The whispering faded, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing on my skin. The night was still, almost suffocatingly quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. I felt it immediately, just as I stepped out of the house. It was around midnight, and my grandmother's village lay deep in the countryside, surrounded by dense forest. The moon barely managed to filter through the heavy branches, casting strange shadows across the narrow path. I had come to help her around the house and maybe escape the noise of the city for a while. But this time, something was different. The silence felt heavy, and the darkness somehow darker, like it had swallowed all light. My grandmother's house had always been a little eerie, quiet, filled with old relics from past generations. with creaky floors that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. But this feeling tonight was like nothing I had ever experienced. There was a thick, oppressive weight in the air, and I could feel it pressing down on me as I made my way to the woodshed to grab more firewood. As I neared the shed, I noticed something unusual. There was a strange smell in the air, something sour, almost rancid, but mixed with a sweetness that turned my stomach. I stopped, trying to pinpoint its source, but the scent was everywhere, drifting through the night air like fog. When I opened the shed, the smell intensified, nearly knocking me backward. I covered my nose, feeling a shiver run down my spine as I looked around. There, in the corner, just barely visible in the darkness, was a small, crumpled object. It looked like an animal, a rabbit maybe, that had somehow found its way inside. But as I stepped closer, I realized it was too wrong. The fur was damp, matted with something thick, but it wasn't blood. Its body looked twisted, as if it had been crushed in some unnatural way, its limbs bent in impossible directions. The strangest part was its eyes. They were wide open, glassy, reflecting a glimmer of the moonlight, and they looked terrified. I backed away, shutting the shed door quickly and feeling my heart begin to race. Something deep in the forest moved. It was subtle, a faint rustling, a snap of a branch, but it made my skin crawl. I strained my ears, but the sound had already faded into the night. I took a step back toward the house, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here, and how vast and dark the forest was around me. Just as I turned, I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye. Just beyond the trees, where the darkness was thickest, something was standing, watching. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, its body impossibly slender, with long arms that seemed to reach nearly to the ground. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, it hadn't moved. It was there, just standing, still as a statue, blending into the shadows so well that it looked like it was part of the forest itself. I felt a chill spread through me, a deep, instinctive fear that told me not to look, not to think, just to run. But I was frozen, my gaze locked on this figure that seemed more shadow than flesh. And then, just as I thought I could break free of its gaze, it moved. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious, and I swear I heard something, a whisper or maybe a sigh, that drifted through the silence, brushing against my ears like a cold breeze. I couldn't understand it, but it sounded wrong, like a language that had no words. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and in that instant, it vanished, melting into the darkness so smoothly that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it all. But the dread lingered. I turned and ran back to the house, bolting the door behind me. Inside, the air was warm, familiar, but the feeling didn't leave me. All night, I stayed awake, staring out the window, half expecting to see that shadow again. The hours dragged on in eerie silence. My grandmother slept peacefully in the next room, unaware, it seemed, of anything unusual. I envied her calm. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. And just as I thought I could relax, as dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw something move at the edge of the forest. A figure, the same tall, unnatural shape, standing between the trees, almost blending with the branches and shadows. Its head tilted in that same unsettling way, like it was studying me, deciding something. Then, just as quickly, it lifted one arm and pointed directly at the house. My blood turned to ice. The hand, if I could call it that, was elongated and clawed, almost skeletal, with fingers that stretched impossibly long. It pointed for a few seconds, holding that chilling gesture, then dropped its arm and turned, slipping deeper into the forest until it vanished from sight. I didn't dare move. It was only when the sun had fully risen, spilling light across the trees and casting away the shadows, that I finally let myself breathe. My mind raced with questions, but fear kept my mouth shut. Even as my grandmother made breakfast, humming softly to herself, I stayed silent. Somehow, I knew that bringing it up wouldn't help, that she might know something about it that I wasn't ready to hear. I spent that day in a fog, jumping at every sound, every creak of the old house. When night approached, the anxiety built in my chest like a growing storm. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy darkness settled over the woods again, and a sense of foreboding filled the air. I didn't want to go to bed, but exhaustion had a way of pulling me under. Sometime around midnight, I heard a sound, soft, almost like a whisper. My eyes snapped open, and my heart raced. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out words, if it was speaking at all, but there was a rhythm to it, a low, chanting murmur that made my skin crawl. And then came the scratching, gentle at first, almost hesitant, right against my bedroom window. I held my breath, staring into the darkness, barely able to make out a faint outline just beyond the glass. A face. It was pressed close, so close I could see its eyes, dark, hollow, endless. Its mouth moved, opening and closing in strange, jerky motions as if it was whispering my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the cold radiating off the glass, see the outline of its twisted fingers scratching, pressing harder as if trying to break through. My heart thundered in my chest, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was listen as that strange, muttering voice filled my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I barely slept after that, watching the window until the first light of dawn finally appeared. When I went downstairs in the morning, my grandmother was waiting for me, her face as pale as I'd ever seen it. She didn't ask what had happened. She just placed a small bundle of herbs in my hand, her fingers cold against mine. "Keep this with you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There are things in these woods that we shouldn't look at, things that shouldn't know we're here." I took the bundle without a word, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a shadow. I didn't ask her any more questions, and she didn't offer any more answers. That day, I packed my bags and left. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, slender figure standing in the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me, and the dark, silent woods beyond. Yet I could feel its gaze on me, even then, a reminder that some things stay with us no matter how far we run. I was the kind of person who shrugged off ghost stories, laughed at haunted house rumors, and assumed it was all down to overactive imaginations. I don't know if I'll ever be able to laugh like that again. Started 2 years ago when I moved into a new apartment. It was a small place, just enough for one person, in an older building. The rent was ridiculously low for the area, but it was clean, and I didn't see anything strange about it at first. The landlord, a quiet older man, didn't seem surprised when I took the apartment immediately, although there was a strange look in his eyes that I'd understand later. The first few nights were uneventful. I settled into the small, cozy living space, grateful for a quiet place to unwind after long workdays. But within a week, I started hearing it, this soft, scratching sound. It was faint at first, and I brushed it off as pipes or the old walls settling. It would come late at night, usually just as I was drifting to sleep, a light scraping sound that almost felt like it was behind my walls. It went on night after night, growing louder, more insistent. I started to feel unsettled, like someone was on the other side, pressing in, almost searching. Then, I started noticing other things. Shadows where they shouldn't be, flickers of movement in the corner of my eye. But whenever I'd turn my head, nothing was there. I'd often feel a cold draft sweeping across my room, even though the windows were closed tight. Sometimes, I'd wake up to find my closet door open, even though I knew I'd shut it before bed. One night, as I lay awake listening to the scraping, I thought I heard something else, whispering, like a breathy, low voice slipping through the walls. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again, unmistakable, a faint whisper just outside my bedroom wall. My heart pounded as I strained to hear, my whole body tense, but I couldn't make out any words. I went to the landlord the next day, asking if he knew of any issues with the building, pest problems, noise complaints, anything. He just gave me a tired look, and in a voice barely louder than a murmur, he said, "It's nothing." His face was tight, almost guilty. I wanted to press him for more, but something told me he wasn't going to be any more honest than he already was. That night, the noises returned, but this time, there was something different. The scratching sounded closer, sharper. I lay there in the dark, my hands gripping the blanket, and suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone. I felt a presence, something cold and oppressive, filling the room. I forced myself to turn on the light, and in the weak glow of the lamp, I saw it. A shape, thin and hunched, with long, spindly fingers, retreating back into the closet, as if it had been watching me. It moved slowly, fluidly, disappearing into the shadows of the open closet. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like I was underwater. I couldn't bring myself to close the closet door. That night left a mark on me, a feeling I couldn't shake. Days passed, and I tried to go back to my normal routine, but every night, I'd find myself staring at that closet, barely breathing, half expecting something to slip out from its depths. Then, one night, I woke up to a new sound, a quiet, raspy breathing, like someone trying to take slow, measured breaths just behind me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst, but I forced myself to stay still, pretending to be asleep. The breathing grew louder, closer, as if something was leaning over me. The air around me felt dense, suffocating. I could feel its presence, filling the small space of my bedroom with a cold that sank into my bones. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move, but when the sound finally stopped, I bolted out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment. In the morning, I searched every inch of my room, desperate to find something that could explain the noise. But there was nothing, just a faint, stale smell that seemed to come from the closet. A smell like damp earth or rotting wood. But things only got worse from there. The scratching came back, this time louder and more erratic. It sounded like it was right on the other side of the wall, moving from one corner to another, as if it were pacing or waiting. Some nights, I'd hear it above me, like something crawling in the ceiling. And then, I started seeing strange marks around the apartment. Tiny, dark smudges near the closet door, thin scratches in the paint that hadn't been there before. One night, I worked up the nerve to take a closer look. As I traced my fingers over the scratches, I realized they weren't random. They were in patterns, almost like symbols. My stomach twisted as I noticed something else. The marks were made by what looked like long, thin fingers. There were 4 of them dragging down the wall in slow, deliberate lines. One evening, I decided to film it. I set up my phone on a stand across the room, aimed it directly at the closet, and left it recording all night. When I woke up, the door was open again, just as before. I didn't want to watch the footage, but something inside me, some dark, morbid curiosity, forced me to. The video was nearly silent. the minutes ticking by without anything happening. But then, around 3:30 a.m., something shifted. The closet door creaked, slowly, inch by inch, until it opened just a crack. I watched, paralyzed, as a shape began to emerge. A pale hand with long, bony fingers reaching out into the room. It didn't come all the way out, just hovered there, as if testing the air. And then, as if it sensed the camera, the hand retreated, and the door quietly closed. That was the last night I stayed in that apartment. I packed everything I could fit into my car and left before the sun even rose. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I dropped off the keys, just gave me that same sad look as he wished me good luck. Since then, I've moved 3 times, and for a while things were quiet. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it, that heavy underwater silence.